Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Encounter. My guest on today's show is C.L. Thomas. She travels widely every year as a fine arts photographer and writer, exploring various afterlife research, out-of-body experiences, and paranormal events in groups. In addition to covering the various paranormal endeavors she has explored, I'll be talking with CL, who also has her own blog and podcast about her book, Dancing with Demons, a Paranormal Encounter. CL Thomas, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Stanley, thank you so much for having me.
In Dancing with Demons, you are very open about sharing with your readers what it was like growing up and seeing ghosts in a dysfunctional family and what a challenging journey it has been for you. You also mention your earliest memory of encountering an entity. What, CL, can you tell me about that entity?
My earliest memory was probably around 2 or 3 years old, and it was an entity of a male figure in my room at nighttime. And this figure had the appearance of, I would see him almost every other night in my room, and he would just be standing in the doorway as if he was like guarding the door. Sometimes he would be around the crib I was in, and he was always smiling, and he kind of looked like a Santa Claus. I remember watching, it was around Christmas time, and I remember watching Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the old 70s version, and the Santa Claus figure in that film, he looked very much like that. So I kind of equated to him and called him Santa. But that was probably the earliest. That went on for probably a couple years off and on with different entities. And I've seen like a lot of lights, like light balls moving around the room, things like that.
Unlike most stories from people who've had similar experiences growing up with the paranormal, you say you didn't initially fear the spirit realm. Why, CL, do you think there was no fear on your part about the supernatural happenings you were encountering in your home?
I didn't know to be afraid of it. It was more of a comforting thing for me. But you have to understand, I had a lot going on in my home at the time. There was a lot of screaming and yelling between my parents, and I was always in my room by myself. And this figure, particularly the Santa figure, he would be in my room smiling. It was like a comforting thing. There was no fear factor to it.
How, CL, did other members of your family react to the paranormal activity that was taking place in your household?
They had no idea that it was going on. It wasn't until I was much older. I was probably around five-ish. I was in kindergarten at the time, and I was home. I had pneumonia, and I was in my room playing with those little box cars. Well, as I was sitting there playing, I was sitting on the bed, kind of looking down at my toys, and I look up, and there was a woman standing at the end of the bed, smiling at me, of course. They're always smiling. She had on this old owl horned glasses. You know what I'm talking about? The old school. And then she had on like a really colorful apron. And those two things alone is how my mother figured it out. The next minute, I kind of bent down to pick up a toy to show it to her, one of the cars I had in my hands. When I did that, she was gone. I ran downstairs to where my mother was in the kitchen, and I said, "Hey, Mom, where'd that lady go? I wanted to show her my toy." And my mom was like, "Well, what lady are you talking about?" We argued about it. I started to cry because she didn't believe me, that kind of thing. Then she said, "Why don't you describe this woman to me?" So I described her to her, and she had this look on her face. And it was almost like her face turned white and she didn't say anything else. Later after dinner, she got out a photo book and she showed me a photo of my great grandmother, whom I've never met. And she said, "This sounds like the lady you've seen. It's just your grandmother." And she started to explain to me that she had passed away. She no longer lived with us. I think she said she lived in heaven, that sort of thing. That's where she kind of figured it out.
It wasn't until you moved to a rental home in Nashville, Tennessee, that you learned to be afraid, something you weren't previously. What, CL, happened in that rental home that frightened you and caused you to be so afraid?
It was a whole different ball game. I experienced the paranormal up until high school and college. I kind of set it aside because I was very career oriented. I was planning on going through med school at the time and that sort of thing. I was very focused. I was also in a lot of sports. That said, I kind of still had the paranormal feelings and things like that, but for the most part, I set it aside to work on my career and what I was going to do for the rest of my life. When I moved into Nashville, that house, it was just a different ball game. It was more than just things moving around. It was the overall feeling of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like oppressive. If that, like, it was a very heavy place to be in. It was affecting me emotionally. It was affecting my partner at the time with negative things. And it was a game changer for me.
Did you, CL, investigate the history of that Nashville house or have a seance with channelers or mediums who were able to make contact with the spirit world to uncover the reason for the frightening happenings at the house?
What happened was, after about the first 2 months, my ex moved out and I had a roommate move in. She was my best friend from the university I was attending at the time. And she started experiencing things as well. And at one point, we just looked at each other. I think it was over Christmas time, and we had a bunch of people in the house. And they were hearing footsteps all night. We had someone sleeping in the living room and they couldn't sleep because they said they kept hearing a woman speak, and that the normal typical haunting kind of stuff. My roommate and I just kind of looked at each other and said, we need to get this straightened out because we were both having problems and we just needed to get it sorted. She ended up calling in different ghost hunters. So one group that came in, they were really good. She also called in a priest that was suggested by this paranormal group, but I'll get into that later. But this group, they came in, they spent the weekend there. They sent me away because I was kind of like the catalyst of this haunting. And as I was away, they caught, oh gosh, probably a couple, this was at the time when we still had CDs. So they were recording everything on CD discs. They were filling up CDs of all the EVPs that they've got from our house. And one of them was of two little girls calling out for me, where's Crystal? Where's Crystal? But the paranormal investigator, she was like, that's not a human, something manipulating us and that sort of thing. They had a historian on their team that started doing the research, and they found that there were a couple murders on the property, a couple of strange deaths that happened. The front line of the Battle of Nashville had taken place on that property. It was part of an old plantation land from antebellum times. And they think that where our house sat might have been the place where the slave quarters were. The house itself, the mansion, was a couple miles up the road where there's a Kroger there now. But they were able to find that plantation and kind of the outline based on old historian property details that you ordered. They were really instrumental in digging up the history.
How, CL, did the paranormal events that were unfolding in and around your haunted residence impact your mind, work, relationships, and other aspects of your life?
So this is where we've come to the conclusion that this was definitely a negative haunting that was going on in the home. It was very oppressive. It started out small. It was almost as if a tornado. If you've ever been in a tornado, it starts out small and then it builds and builds and builds. It was very much like that. The hauntings were very unnoticeable activity. It would just be noises, shadows, that sort of thing. But the more we paid attention to it, the more that energy grew it wasn't just about seeing shadows anymore. There was stuff being flung across the room. Stuff was being moved around the house. Stuff would disappear. That energy was also affecting me. I would be severely depressed for no reason. It was almost as if it was like attached to me, and somehow I became very isolated. All I wanted to do was sit in my room and do recordings and try to communicate with this other side. But it wasn't like your typical paranormal investigator. This, with curiosity, this is totally different. It was like it had literally captured me. Like I didn't want to hang out with friends anymore. I wasn't doing the things I love to do anymore. I was very focused on it, and that's all I could focus on. It grew and grew like that for several months, to the point where I became very suicidal, and then I was diagnosed with cancer.
Your book reflects your personal experience with the demonic like force, and it's apparent It has altered your perspective of the paranormal and set you on the road for the truth, which you have taken and so eloquently write about. What advice would you give to someone who finds themselves facing a demon?
I think it's all about reclaiming your space, knowing who you are, knowing your intentions on how to kind of find yourself, because a lot of it I drew to myself. That's what I believe. Just focusing so much on the negative entities, I was able to draw that in through my own negative thoughts and just not able to pull out of those dark places. It's very hard to answer this question. There's been a lot of different cases very similar to mine. I know Hans Holzer did a profile case on a family that was haunted in Texas, and very similar, except for we didn't have like dead bugs or anything like that appearing in our home. But it was a family in Texas. They had a young son who, for some reason, just couldn't pull away from this entity. And even though the family moved away, Hans Holzer says that was his one regret, that he couldn't reach this kid. Years later, this entity, according to his sister, still affected him to the point where he actually committed suicide. Same exact things that I had gone through. And there is another group that went in and kind of went over. It was Dave Schrader and his group from Holzer Files. If you've ever seen that show, they went down and they kind of reopened that case a little bit to explore what happened and how Hans could have helped this boy. And they were working on another case at the time. It was a lady who was haunted with a girl who lived in a house very similar to mine. She said she was getting sick, she was angry, depressed, felt like she was trapped. But the way that they helped her, they sat her down and they told her, you're very intuitive. You can draw this energy to yourself, but at the same time, you have to empower yourself to be able to put out light energy instead of pulling negative energy to yourself. People can only help you for so much, but you have to take the initiative to help yourself as well.
You, CL, have explored many aspects of the paranormal world. And what I would like to do now is ask you about two of them. Firstly, what has your research come up with regarding the afterlife and what happens to our physical bodies when we vacate it and enter the spirit realm?
I definitely believe that consciousness still exists. I'm a very big believer that energy doesn't go away. I don't believe we die. I believe we shift into a different phase of life, whatever that may be. For others, the paranormal is very much about investigating. When you talk to investigators, their number one thing is they want to prove if there's life after death. To me, I already know it exists. So what's next? I want to know, how do we communicate with that other world? How can we prepare ourselves to not get stuck in places like prisons and some of these most haunted locations that you go to? Why is that consciousness still there is my question and what I want to get into. So that's what I'm looking for.
I wish you luck with that, and that would be a great book to write about, and I'd love to interview you about it. That's great what you're thinking about. Secondly, CL, I'd be interested to know about some of the out-of-body experiences people had and shared with you.
I don't really know too many people that have had out-of-body experiences. I've had one myself. I have taken the Gateway program with the Monroe Institute, and a lot of them will talk about out-of-body experiences. But for me, my own experience, I can talk about that. It was, gosh, I hate to talk about this, but there was a time where I actually did try to commit suicide. This was a long time ago, and I had taken a bunch of pills, and I was in my room by myself, and I had awakened and actually got up, walked over to my bedroom door, and put my hand on the doorknob to walk out the door. And I turned around and I was still sleeping in the bed. And this was like so surreal. I could feel the doorknob, the coldness of the door handle in my hand. I felt the carpet under my feet. And somehow I knew if I had walked out that door, it would have been over with. So that was one of the what I perceive as an out-of-body experience.
And that's a wow experience. Like I thank you for sharing it because it is indeed so personal. So I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of that.
There's another one. One of my friends, his name is Haunted MD. He's an emergency physician, and he's always talking about different things that happen in the ER room. And one of the things that he talks about is he had a patient that they were trying to save, and he felt something blow out of that body through him and out the wall, literally, like just blow out through the wall. And he said he was filled with such an emotion from that, and he knew that that was that person's spirit kind of moving away from the body. He said it was almost like it just shot right through him, and it jolted him. I always found that as a really interesting story.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy your book, Dancing with Demons, a Paranormal Encounter, and learn about your blog and your podcast, how can they do that?
They could look me up. My website is clthomas.org. Everything is on that website. My social media, the books. I have a radio show that's on there. A lot of my artwork is on there. I do a lot of spirit art that you can book a session there. So it's clthomas.org.
C.L. Thomas, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. Yakking with you has been a really wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.